Project Director for Public Engagement and Outreach, Biodiversity Collaborative. So on behalf of Biodiversity Collaborative, I welcome you all. I'll be co-moderating the session this afternoon with Dr. Ravi Chellam, who is the CEO of MetaString Foundation and also a coordinator for Biodiversity Collaborative. Quickly, before we start, just a couple of housekeeping announcements, the usual. Keep yourself on mute unless you are speaking. It will really help the audio experience overall. If you have a question, please type it out in the Q&A box that you have at the bottom of the screen. We will curate them and take them together at the end during the QA session. Also, for your information, the meeting is being recorded. Now, just a few thoughts to kick things off for the session. Today is International Biodiversity Day, May 22nd, and we are not exactly singing Happy Biodiversity Day tune here, are we? Indeed, as per the latest IPBES report, if you see, 75% of land-based and 66% of marine biodiversity today is threatened. India being one of the mega diverse countries in the world, 90% of area under biodiversity hotspots in India are under serious threats. Take a moment to take that in, 90% of area under biodiversity hotspot. So the science is out there with a clear message, but there is a lack of serious collective action. Now, why is that? Why are we not treating biodiversity crisis as if our own house is on fire? How are different stakeholders looking at it from their lens? That's what we want to unpack today with a very distinguished set of panelists. Hope you find it interesting. Now, I'll come straight to our first panelist, Sahana. So Sahana is really one of the few strong voices in science journalism today, telling the stories of climate change and biodiversity loss. Many of you would have read her articles in Mongabay. What I learned recently is that she has been honored by Global Landscape Forum as one of the 16 women restoring the earth. How cool is that? So Sahana, let me come to you. The fact that there are not too many like you, especially compared to people writing on mainstream issues, why do you think biodiversity today gets so little airtime in media? Is it because it is perceived too sciencey, it won't get readership, there's no demand for people, no eyeballs, or is it just not considered that important? Also, if you could comment on how do we change this? So over to you, Sahana.
Thanks, Anindya and Biodiversity Collaborative for this opportunity. So first of all, I like to clarify a couple of points here. I think that there are some parts of biodiversity that get really more attention, and there are some parts which really get very little attention. For example, if you look at the media coverage, you'll see so much of our coverage is also dedicated to tree plantations, right? Or tigers or cheetahs, for example, because these are also connected to what's happening in terms of policies, legislations in India. So there's a direct connect and there's a direct relatability where there are other topics, very interesting topics, according to me, about our soil biodiversity, for example, which gets very little attention. And the other point here is that with digital media, the lines between what was considered as mainstream or offbeat has kind of blurred. So what you're going to see is biodiversity coverage, but in a very different form. So what we are seeing is not all the coverage also comes in terms of say 1,000-word journalistic writing. It also comes in packets of information, for example, videos or say a social media post. And that also comes with the content strategies that different media outlets also adopt. So we do consider biodiversity as a mainstream issue. Definitely, the organizations that I've been with, but we also try to also break down what does biodiversity mean into different packets of information. So there are some parts which get more attention, some parts which get little attention. And what we hope to do is the parts that are getting little attention or deserve more attention, we can perhaps maybe use different content strategies, different ways of storytelling to highlight those underserved topics in biodiversity. The other factor here is, yes, Anindo, I would agree that some of these topics are considered too sciencey. For example, if I take soil microbiome, so the word itself can be quite overwhelming for readers. And what we need to really do in this kind of case is change that perception. And to change that perception is to really bring in stories where we connect with different stakeholders or sources who work, say, with soil biodiversity. It could be a farmer or a citizen engaging with soil, engaging with the sciencey part of soil as well. And that brings a human approach to that particular aspect in biodiversity, and which is easier for audiences to engage with. And by doing this, it is in no way that we are dumbing down the science, because whenever we interact with scientists, for these kind of stories, we also get concerns that, oh, are we going to dumb down the science? It's not dumbing down the science, it's just engaging with a different audience and in a very different style. And that's how you're going to also do your scientific outreach, right, in these kind of topics. The other point is finding right sources. For us, it's important to know who's working on what, and it could be a scientific expert, it could be a social science researcher in that space, it could be other stakeholders, NGO workers. So for us also, finding that milieu of people becomes important. And sometimes in biodiversity, there are so many people working on so many subjects, yet at the same time on very specific subject there's only a small group of people working on that. So I think the time that it takes for us to really find out the sources, that also matters, which is why I think outreach by different parties is very important. For example, the outreach by Biodiversity Collaborative, right? And how do we get things started? How do we get it right? I think communicating in regional languages by experts, which is really important, no matter how many papers you've published, right? But if you're able to communicate that science to an editor or to a journalist in any part of the country, in the language of that region, I think that really matters a lot. That really helps build an audience base on biodiversity, helps build more contacts, and also helps build us more stories for the regional readers, regional audiences as well. And definitely stories on citizen engagement, citizen science is really happening in India. And if we tell more stories on citizen engagement, in different biodiversity related projects, weave in the science, weave in the policy into these kind of stories, I think you have a really good packet of information. And that's how some of us have been doing this, and we will continue to build on this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was very insightful, and you're absolutely right. The amount of coverage we see on certain issues is disproportionate. And what I'm taking from you is also the need for different voices and regional languages and regional stories being told. And speaking of region and story, I want to now move to Tarsh. There's a very interesting story, happening in the Nilgiris. Now, Tarsh is a researcher and conservationist with not just intellectual interest, but there's a solid body of work on human inclusive models of conservation, be it human-elephant conflict to coexistence or community-based management of lantana in the Nilgiris, which is a huge problem. Tarsh, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on whether the role of biodiversity in human well-being is well understood in the context that you work in? Or is it like it's a lived experience, but not articulated that way? Does it also vary between the indigenous communities that you work with and the rest of us or the rest of people? So if you could throw some light on that, that would be very interesting. Over to you, Tarsh.
Thanks, Anandu, and thanks everyone at the Biodiversity Collaborative. It's really nice to be here and have this space to discuss all of these really interesting issues. So taking a step back and maybe slightly dissecting the term biodiversity, I think this is vital in kind of better understanding this. There's a person, David Takacs, who wrote a book in '96, I think, that questions the idea of biodiversity. And I think one of his key points was biodiversity as a term is perhaps best defined as that which defies precise definition. And I think that's the starting point. Everybody kind of uses the term loosely, but nobody kind of completely understands what biodiversity means. And I think Takacs' main argument in his book is that it's a new term coined by scientists to give nature, ecosystems, any of these forests, grasslands, any of these old terms that we used, more a kind of sciencey feel so that it's taken more seriously. But I think this term, biodiversity, is largely not understood by anybody. Scientists to start with, there's alpha biodiversity, beta biodiversity, and gamma diversity from a scientific perspective, right? That's a biodiversity in one place, comparing biodiversity in two places and comparing biodiversity across multiple spaces, multiple ecosystems. And so even how do you understand or measure biodiversity is not known. And when you go into the policy realm, you will find forest departments and all of these people banding the word around, not really knowing what biodiversity means. And very often when some understanding comes up, it's like a checklist or trying to clock up who has more biodiversity, right? Which may not necessarily be the best approach for understanding nature, or more importantly, saving biodiversity or nature, whatever we want to call it. So I think even the CBD definition as well, the variability, I'm sure everybody knows it. It's the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic systems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Clearly, it's a mouthful that nobody can even memorize, even people who go through this in formal education. It's difficult to get your head around this concept. So my overall question is, should we focus on biodiversity, or should we just use some other term that has greater traction with local people and people at multiple scales? Going back to the scientific realm, we don't even know what biodiversity is, right? There's the Wallacean shortfall in terms of not understanding the distribution of species. There's a Linnaean shortfall in not even yet knowing how many species exist or any of this. So yeah, my overall question is whether this term is really the appropriate term when you link it to human well-being, because very often the focus is on counting species, and I don't know if that's useful. Going to the overall question of, so yeah, there is all this complication, but we all know that you need to save nature, you need to use as many kind of evocative terms as possible for it to sit in the collective imagination of people everywhere. And here again, I think there are kind of multiple issues. For the local people, particularly the indigenous communities, there is a deep link with nature for their everyday needs. And there is no doubt at all that biodiversity is hugely important. Right? All their songs, their myths, everything revolves around nature. And there's really no question. They need biodiversity on a daily basis for everything from what they eat to their daily kind of livelihood activities, even things like for their cultural kind of activities. The drums need skin from a particular kind of species that is illegal. Their bowstrings need a particular kind of wine that is harder to collect. They are very well aware of what's happening to all of this diversity and how all of this is changing. But they have no rights or no permissions to co-manage these spaces and understand it. So I think this, of course, varies hugely between different ethnic communities. Onindo, going back to your question, the hunter-gatherers, or people who are at least traditionally hunter-gatherers, say the Kartnaikins, the Betakurumbas, and the Paniyas, clearly have much stronger links with nature because they are dependent on it very closely. More settled agriculturalist communities like the Molukurumbas and the Chettis, for example, they still interact with biodiversity and nature on a very everyday basis for their farming and lots of other needs, but they are one step removed in terms of how much they depend on a multitude of species in their everyday lives. But to me, the bigger problem is actually us urban people, and this disconnect that the traditional conservation paradigm has created between us and nature. right? We've been very good at protected areas. We protected all these huge areas. We publish figures every year about how India's green cover is increasing, and only those poor tribals there are screaming hoarse that it's no good, it's full of lantana, all these protected areas, right? It's full of invasive species that have completely wiped out everything else. People have argued that it's very good for some species, and yeah, fair enough, lantana has benefited, say, maybe bulbuls and some kinds of butterflies. But we're not talking about bulbul and butterfly reserves here. We're tiger reserves. And even with that disparity, there is no understanding in the mainstream world until very recently, in the last few years, to what extent lantana has kind of destroyed forests. 30 to 40% of all parks are now dense lantana. And this is something people like the Soligas in particular have been crying hoarse about for 3 decades. Since the time they stopped burning, they have complained that forests are completely taken over by some species. And I'd argue that it is our approach till now of saving land that has been the problem in disconnecting people from nature. So again, to kind of end on a slightly more positive note, I think we really should be reframing the whole conservation narrative. And it's not about saving a Bandipur or a Mudumalai or a Wayanad. It is about living well with whatever nature is out around us. How do we increase urban biodiversity quotients in cities like Bangalore or Delhi or anywhere, Mumbai? And how do we reconnect people with nature? As long as you go through this capitalist system that produces and gives you stuff that you have no connection with, you are always going to blame that tribal and that person for this degradation or the loss of forests without understanding your role in it, or our role, all of us urban people who inhabit these spaces. So I really think a paradigm shift in the way we think about conservation is the only way we are going to link this up across different groups of people. It's not the indigenous people or the poor farmers or the rural agriculturalists, even the non-tribals. Anyone living in any rural space has some connect with nature. It's largely us urban people, I think, who've been completely disconnected. And there is a very urgent need to reconnect them with nature and biodiversity in whatever ways we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darshan. That was quite insightful and like radical. Like starting right from, should we even use the term biodiversity, to really reframing the conservation paradigm narrative, to the fact that there is a us versus nature duality in urban people. I think, you did an amazing job in unpacking this. You also spoke about no rights and no permission and the local people's relationship with biodiversity. And on that axis, I want to continue to the human and rest of nature interaction by hearing from you, Dr. Anita Verghese. Anita has been amazing force behind real on-ground work that Keystone Foundation has been doing on different aspects of biodiversity, including livelihood aspects like apiculture-based livelihood, restoration, and human-wildlife relationship. So, Dr. Anita, as somebody spearheading implementation and action research, if I may term it that way, please tell us about the ground realities and challenges that you may come across in relation to people's understanding and attitude towards biodiversity. And by people, I mean both, like the way Tash put it, the indigenous people and the urban folks. And I'm asking this question especially since you work in one of world's 36 biodiversity hotspot, which is the Western Ghats region. So very interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone at the Biodiversity Collaborative for having me here. And I'm really, it's very exciting to hear Sahana's take on it and Tash's. I think it gives me a good way to get into what I wanted to say. And, just even reflecting on the topic that biodiversity misunderstood and ignored. I mean, I feel it's far less ignored than it was when I was entering this field 30 years ago. And I agree that in a human use landscape, human development needs will take precedence over biodiversity needs. So that's one of the realities of biodiversity in this. And I totally liked what Tash pitched, because that's also my question: misunderstood by whom? And misunderstood, I mean, have we, the experts and the technical people, got it right in the first place, is also something that we need to discuss more, more openly. And I wanted to say that, Anindya, that was a great question about what have we learned from the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve Keystone Foundation, established in 1993, and even then, and continues today, our mission of working on the quality of life and the environment. And I think that sort of set the stage for us even 30 years ago, this understanding that one cannot be disconnected from the other. It's an indigenous worldview. It's a worldview that has probably left many of us, I don't want to say urban, non-urban, because I also find it a problem of disconnected people in the rural also. So it's a mindset that we could blame it on many factors that has disconnected us from our environment, and we no longer see the linkages. We like to box biodiversity, we like to box human civilization, and we want them to remain separate. We want them to have corridors of convenience where we can interact. But the reality is not like that today, especially as I live in this biosphere reserve. The reality is God in our backyard, leopards, bears scavenging over our dump yards. And we know that the tiger and the elephant is not too far away. So this is the reality of living in a space like a biosphere reserve. And it definitely makes us think about the term biodiversity. I would say that for one of the approaches, a couple of the approaches that have worked for us is the fact that any landscape, especially a human-used landscape, a human-dominated landscape, there is a narrative, a place-based history. There is a narrative about the landscape. Taking that narrative into whatever conservation action or implementation or research, I think has been a big shortfall of the way we've approached biodiversity. There's never been room to include these narratives in our definition and work about biodiversity. One of the approaches, something central to the work, what we do through Keystone is to work on sustainable use of natural resources. And this has, it's not as if it's one formula that will work for all. It's highly species specific, it's highly site specific, it's culture specific. To recognize that diversity when you're talking about sustainable use is really something that, I think several times as biologists, as ecologists, we've shied away from it because in our systems approach, we want some things to look a little more simpler so that we can have results quite quicker. But the reality of sustainable use, it's possible. Indigenous communities have shown that it's been a way of life, that we have not invested enough research in that direction has probably been one of our shortfalls. I just wanted to share an example of the work that we do on wild bees, for example. We took into consideration, there's a whole enterprise model linked to it, there's livelihoods linked to it. When we did some of the ecological work to look at populations of wild bees, the two factors that really influence their population, the long-term survival of their population, was not the amount of harvest or the amount of destruction of hives. It was actually the availability of nesting sites, availability of tall trees and cliffs. So, that really is an indicator that if you're messing up with the ecosystem, logging, allowing quarrying, you're actually impacting populations in the long term. So this kind of a research, which also includes narratives of the landscape, is really something that has worked well for us. And I think, when we refer back to fire and certain practices of the landscape, it's taken such a long time for us to even open up to the idea of fire and allow scientists to conduct experiments, right? And shouldn't we have just cut short that time by just listening to some of that indigenous and traditional ways and practices that were prevalent in it? Today, I heard about, I was at this conference and I saw this fantastic experiment of having controlled grazing where they brought in some 300 sheep into a controlled pen and they have the sheep grazing on the grass. This is the kind of science and experiments we are doing post all the wildfires and bushfires. So we're sort of investing in a lot of science, and I feel that we could have done better with it if we had also listened to what was available in that landscape. So that perhaps is something that I would say is important. And finally, I just want to say that, what about this whole our understanding of disturbance, our understanding of perturbations to the system? In one particular system, which we studied for a span of 3 to 4 years. It was in the Satyamangalam Reserve Forest before it became a protected area, where phoenix leaves are harvested in large scale for broom industry. Now that when we mapped out all the interactions that happen in a system like that, there's several interactions. There's the physical interactions, there's the wild herbivores, there's the domestic herbivores, there's harvest, a whole bunch of interactions. And what our study, some of the results that our study yielded were very interesting. Is that what we could see very clearly was a pattern that in areas or in forest communities, plant communities, where there was a lot of interaction, we find diversity and richness indices high. But in those landscapes or habitats where interactions were considerably, relatively less, what we found was rarity, endemicity increase. So you're likely to find more rarer species and more endemic species. So all is to say that there are trade-offs, there are cost benefits, and I think we have to be willing and open to understand that. Too quickly we clamp down on certain ways of using the forest as bad. And I think that has been at the bottom of this alienation that has crept in the larger community. Of course, with indigenous communities, today we have the FRA, which is trying to set right that historical injustice, but everyone's talking about, there's also an alienation that's happened to other stakeholders. And how we're going to be repairing that is something that we need to look forward to in the future. Finally, I'd like to just leave with this thought that the idea, I'm a beneficiary by staying in the biosphere reserve. I'm a beneficiary of all these protected areas, right? So I know that it has a certain kind of value. So I don't know if I would say that protected areas don't have a value, but I would say we really need to question, is this enough? And is protected area, the kind of interaction I have with a protected area, I go there on a Sunday, I go there on a Wednesday, is that enough? Or is that protected area got to be much more wider? And therefore, how can we have more areas for conservation, and how can that be more participatory, more governed by communities that have capacity? How can we be engaged in building those capacities? Today is definitely with issues like human-wildlife interactions, it's no longer the purview of the Forest Department. So many times they are stretched in so many directions, especially when all of this is happening outside of forest areas. And that's when the whole community needs to come in, the panchayats need to come in, local bodies need to be part of that issue. And I think more and more conservation issues are making it sort of imminent that we have a more inclusive model. And I think an inclusive model of biodiversity, a definition itself, is something that I also would recommend highly. Thank you very much.
That was super, super insightful. And you mentioned initially a couple of things where I saw Sameer smiling and vigorously nodding. You talked about place-based history and narrative. I know Rain Matter talks a lot about place-based and also tacit and embedded knowledge. We have been talking about knowledge commons. But towards the end, you also touched on something which is very, I felt important, which was the whole thing about participatory governance, FRA, participatory governance, local management. And that's where I want to come to Ashokji and really hear the perspective from government, if you will. So Ashokji brings a very unique lens to the discussion, which is that of governance. He has more than 3 decades of experience as IFS officer with roles in Cabinet Secretariat, to Ministry of Tribal Affairs, various state-run initiatives. I think Ashokji has had a first-hand view of both policymaking and its implementation. It will be fair to say that. So Ashokji, sir, we are very interested to understand a policymaker's attitude and approach towards biodiversity. And when I say that, it's not just with people directly working with the forest departments or the IFS officers, but especially other ministries and departments. Is it perceived as a critical element at all? And I wonder what is really hindering a stronger implementation of laws and provisions that we already have, like PBRs, and Dr. Anita spoke about Forest Rights Acts, for example. So if you could throw some light and give us that perspective, it will be wonderful. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Ravi and team, for having me here on this occasion of International Biodiversity Day. Let me have a slightly different perspective on the issue of declining biodiversity and perhaps way forward. Firstly, there is a misgiving that when we talk about biodiversity, we get confined to the area of forest and the wildlife, not in the farm sector, the biodiversity loss which is happening in a much more bigger way, which would be a threat to the food security and the very survival of human beings. That's the one issue which I thought I should be flagging here. For example, if you talk about some of the traditional varieties of paddy or the pulses or the sheep or goat or cattle, so those are the things which were neglected in the past for the reason of ensuring food security. But with adequate food being on the table, these issues are coming on the table at the highest level and creeping into the policy formulation stages. How it is translating into action at this thing, there's a big question mark over that one, because how it is conceived at the top level and how it translates, there is some gap, and perhaps that is one of the reasons that there are challenges. More importantly, we need to understand that India is a country of about 140 crore people. In terms of scheduled tribes, I would like to say that there will be more than 710 communities which are scheduled as the tribal, and the what Todas perceive as a particular way of living is not the same as the Kukis in Manipur or Nagaland perceive to be. So also is what the Minas or the Bhils perceive in the Western India is different from what the Orans in the Central India and part of that. So that is the kind of challenge which I am talking about when the policy formulation is taking place and it's being implemented. Look at the physical diversity in terms of the countries. For example, in agroclimatic zone wise, there's a 15 agroclimatic zones and 72 subzones in that one. So when you are formulating a policy, normally it is driven by the ease of implementation and the way it becomes the proper execution takes place. And in the process, this kind of a diversity which exists at times get lost. So that is one challenge for the policymakers, that you cannot have a uniform prescription across the country as diverse as India, having diverse cultural entities as well as the diverse agroclimatic zones. So that is the second part. The third and more important part of it is the competing demand for the resources. Now, we have about 1/6 of the human population and 1/15 of the land mass. And even if you look into the ocean or the sea proportion, which is available to the Indian population, it is disproportionately smaller. So the focus when the initial stages post-independent India was on ensuring the livelihood security, food security, and that partly led to the situation we are in. That doesn't mean that this course correction is not happening or hasn't happened. It's being attempted, but as the challenges prevail across the sectors and the diverse land, and it would continue to be so. For example, when you are trying to say that biodiversity, it depends what it means to a particular community. If you are coming from Western Ghats, say in the part of Karnataka, in the districts of Shimoga or the North Canara or South Canara. So the biodiversity to those communities is different than what it means to the people in the rest of the places. So that has to be understood, because every community which adopts or tries to further the cause is a beneficiary, and the one who is not benefited out of it is not interested in or investing in that conservation or development of that one. So that is important. So when we are talking about the policies, inclusivity is fine, but whether are they inclusive in a right sense of the term? For example, when the government brought in legislation for determining the pre-existing rights of the tribal people, there came a challenge, which is right now is the one that so many others who were using these resources, they feel that you are alienating them from the access to these resources, and that number is equally significant or much more than the scheduled tribes who are enjoying these beneficiaries. And it's not that only amongst the scheduled tribes also, some of the communities are dominant ones, they are usurping all the benefits of it. And their concern is not of a biodiversity, but perhaps they are more keen to have the dominant access over the resources. And that kind of a challenge comes in. Now, the other important part which I wanted to bring in is that is there a way of addressing these things? Perhaps yes. For example, if you look at the National Education Policy of 2020, which has catered to the diverse requirements of the educational requirement across the country. It talks about the mother tongue, it talks about the vocation, it talks about these things. So it is yeah. So that is the kind of challenges which is being faced. So to sum it up, there are the attempt to have the evidence-based policy, moving away from for example, in the forest and wildlife conservation species to the focus of ecological or environmental ecosystem approach to the conservation, and stopping tree plantation across the forested areas and leaving it to the farmers, and involving children to the curriculum and connecting with the nature in whatever way it has been mentioned. Perhaps these are some of the ways of carrying it forward, and that's where I stop right now, and willing to answer if there is any queries subsequently. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that was really comprehensive, and you talked about national level initiative, NEP. From our side, as you might know, we are trying to advocate and really work in the background for a national mission on biodiversity. So that kind of action is needed, but I'll leave that for maybe a later discussion. And for now, I want to come back, to Samir for his comments. Now, the fact is, whenever we have conversations about things not moving in India, one part of it is to say that, government is not doing enough. The other part of it is also people saying that, invariably the question of funding that comes up, right? That's the elephant in the room in many ways. So Samir, as a CEO of Rainmatter Foundation, and Rainmatter in some ways is one of the few trendsetters in this, investing in biodiversity conservation and its regenerative usage. So what I would want to know from you, Samir, is in the philanthropic world, why is funding for biodiversity still a trickle compared to other issues like education, public health, etc.? Is it a perception issue, or is the economics not well worked out or understood? Also, referring back to what Anita was commenting, given Rainmatter's work on bioregional localization and knowledge commons, could private funding be a catalyst for much bigger changes in people's life in India through biodiversity, along with, of course, government support? Could it work? So I leave it to you to really comment on that. It would be very interesting. Over to you, Samir.
Thanks, Anindu. Yeah, I don't think we are trendsetters. I think we are following a trend that evolution got on to hundreds of millions of years ago. In as much that biodiversity actually solves many problems. So when you look at a problem as large as the climate problem and all the intersected problems with it, you have to fall back on the building blocks of life, because that's what is being threatened right now. So, and to your other point, I mean, I'll go into some depth of the whats and whys, but very broadly, I don't think funding, philanthropy, governments, entrepreneurship, researchers, etc., are very, very different from the rest of society, right? We are a function of it, and our common mainstream beliefs shape both our alignment and our opposition, right? Which is why mainstream thought is aligned with it. Right? Mainstream thought has been about, as Mr. Rai was saying, about food security and about other forms of security, about control, about trying to make everything predictable. And this is a journey we started hopping on to 12,000 years ago, but really accelerated about 600 years. Right. So the need to maximize on some of the functions that what we call biodiversity provides, that what we call nature around us provides. We want to maximize on a few, want to optimize a few, at the cost of many others that we don't see or realize the value. That's what's really happened. And those trade-offs is where issues like climate change, issues like biodiversity collapse, and all of these have occurred. For instance, I mean, when you need to drive on a road, you pave a very large surface. It's geological functions, it's biological functions, all collapse for that stretch of road. But you win this one function of being able to travel on it really, really smoothly, really, really fast, predictable. Right? That's a trade-off you make. And as you went on making that trade-off on every square kilometer of the planet, right? Somewhere the balance tilted. So I mean, below a certain point, whether it's your gut biome or whether it's the biological and geological functions that happen in every square inch of the planet, beyond a point, it's the drop in that functionality adds up, and you have a tummy ache, or you have flooding in Bangalore, or you have excess heat waves, or one of many other different symptoms that we see around us. Right? We're trying to bring a lens to it when we use the term biodiversity. Its other name is the real, right? And it has existed for hundreds of millions of years. For the last few hundred years, especially, we have pretended that it doesn't exist, or we can get away with, ignoring it. When we build our cities, when we create our farms, when we create our highways, when we create anything in the human realm, right? Today, almost completely ignores the fact that there were functions the functions playing out, right? Whether or not we directly benefited from it, we were indirectly benefiting from them. We were interacting with them at least. We ignore the fact that these functions were playing out. And we are seeing it in our innovation, in our funding as well. If you look at startups in Bangalore, if you look at VC funding, if you look at innovation, it is all deeply rooted in chemistry and biology, chemistry and physics today. It comes from electronics, it comes from mathematics, it comes from mechanics, but very little of it acknowledges or comes from biology. right? Very little of it comes from underlying geological principles. So with this wonkiness in our approach, with this bias towards a certain set of functions, it was always loaded in the favor of losing out on that functionality eventually. And that's what we are seeing. Our entire evolution has been around wherever we were or wherever we moved to. Right? We are calling it fancy words like bioregionalism today, but we essentially evolved with all of these little functions, all the species, the flora, the fauna, the good, the bad around us. And we learned to make use of it.
Samir, you're muted. You're muted. Can somebody
I think
unmute?
accidentally.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Huh,
I
no, it's
think I
fine.
got muted.
No, it's fine.
Are you able to hear me, Ananda?
Yes, go ahead.
No, I think something's off.
We are able to hear you, Samir.
Samir, speak.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
we can
hear
hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah. So, so we've taken a root cause approach to this, and we believe that we have to look at this functionality. We have to look at how this lens will get into the mainstream efforts, whether it's food systems or how we build our economies or address our any need. And it's not going to happen in just research or just conservation or just farmlands or just construction or whatever. It's got to be everything all at once. Can we significantly make a dent in it? We don't know yet. Can we try and change our lens in a significant way? I think if enough of us who think about this and believe in this, and I think a lot of us on this call are there today, I think if we team up, could influence this lens in a big way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to hear from you, because you take us like 3 steps back and say, okay, go back to the drawing board, go back to the basics. So I heard, can we dent? Yes, if enough of us come together and we try to change our lens. So thank you for that, Samir. Now, for the next part, I would like to hand over to Dr. Ravi Chellam. We have some questions that have come in the Q&A box, and maybe some comments and some pointers, Ravi, you want to pick up and sort of wrap it up and bring it home. We have heard different perspectives. So if you could do that.
Thanks, Anindu, and thanks to all the panelists. Just an announcement, Sahana had to leave because she had another appointment. The other 4 panelists are there. It was very interesting to hear these very different perspectives. Many of these people we interact, but when we structure a conversation like this, you're enriched by the perspectives that come to the table. We're also very glad that Kamal Baba has joined us from Boston, very early morning for him. So Kamal, having listened to all the panelists, what do you have to say?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for these really very novel and innovative views from people working in different sectors. And so it's a morning here. I'm just going to start my morning here, so I'm going to be very optimistic. And otherwise, the rest of the day will not be very good. I have been in this business for 60 years, and I see a lot of change, and I'm very encouraged by that change. 5 or 7 years ago, this type of discussion would not have been possible. 5 or 7 years ago, I don't think we would have been able to bring people from different sectors together for such a discussion. 5 or 7 years ago, I don't think there would have been philanthropic organizations in Bangalore who would take up the area of biodiversity and consider it very important. So these are many of the reasons, why I am very optimistic. I think change is on its way, and we must accelerate this change. How do we accelerate this change? A conservation paradigm, I think a lot of people have talked about conservation paradigm. Absolutely first and foremost, we have to bring that change. We have to move away from the discussion of protected areas to what Anita referred to as multifunctional landscapes. And in these multifunctional landscapes, we have to bring people together to see how we can sustain these multifunctional landscape, keeping in mind both the human well-being as well as biodiversity considerations. People have to be at the center of all our activities, whether these are concerned with management of protected areas, or whether these are concerned about our focus on outside protected areas in multifunctional landscapes where there is a lot of biodiversity. I tell people biodiversity is everywhere. Biodiversity is my hands. 2 hands have a lot of biodiversity. Inside our body, biodiversity. Biodiversity is in my backyard. Biodiversity is in my room in the form of a very nice plant, which I enjoy looking at. So people have to be at the center of action. Multifunctional landscape I referred to. Second, science. Our science must change. Our science has to be focused on these areas where people are using biodiversity. It has to be interdisciplinary. It has to be multidimensional, and that is what the Biodiversity Collaborative is all about in many ways. And third is how do we mainstream biodiversity in every school, in every institution, in every department of the government. That again is one of the missions of the National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-being. And this is going to be enabled by technology. I think we have technology which we have barely begun to use this technology to mainstream biodiversity. And I think I'm very hopeful that in the next 4 or 5 years, we'll be able to turn the corner. And finally, I should say this debate should continue, and we'll take all these insightful observations and comments made and do something about it, and we'll continue. This is just a beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Kamal. Now we'll turn to the questions that we have in the which have been given by the audience. The first one is from Nishant, and this is addressed to actually all panel members. Anybody who wants to weigh in should weigh in on this. How do we develop empathy in people for nature, for biodiversity? What is the magic potion that we can use? Or is there a magic potion? Samir?
I don't know about magic potions, but I do know that from whatever that's been going on from an economic point of view, from a quote unquote development point of view, 90% people, at least in a country like India, have not won. They are, you can quantify it, and they have lost on most parameters in their lives, including the economic one. Definitely on their own assets in their backyard, on health, on most dimensions that you can actually quantify. I would imagine that if 90% people have actually lost from this, they would want to see change. And the one strength they have on their side, in their favor, is their local biodiversity. And that's what you build on, right? That's what civilizations got built on. So I think if we start a process to visualize this, what this loss looks like, to connect the dots back to solutions that come from your biodiversity, I think people will start to understand it and respect it a lot better.
Thanks, Samir. And increasingly, there is hard evidence of the positive impacts nature is having on physical and mental health of people, right? That's something that we don't make a connection normally with biodiversity. There are two questions, one explicitly by Amrita and the other by an anonymous attendee. This is around this whole thing of, we all know there's a crisis. Why do we still allow industry and development to continue to destroy whatever little that is left of wild ecosystems and nature? And the anonymous question is slightly different. It's saying, if there is one small area of action, what is the action that we should take? And I'm going to take the fact that I have the mic to answer the anonymous question. One is, stop dignifying destruction of nature as development. Destruction of nature is destruction. It is not development. But I would go to Ashok, having served in the government. How do permissions get given for destruction of nature?
I think again there is a issue of perspective from whom you are asking this question and whom is being addressed. For example, the large number of people who are unemployed, and there are some industries being set up and which can provide a few thousand jobs to them. For them, it doesn't matter that it's not a destruction anymore for them. They are not concerned about it. So but it's also true that it is not always, it's a sort of a open-ended sort of a permissions given for anything which is ecologically destructive or which can have a detrimental effect on the nature in the long term, because these decisions are taken based on intersectoral consultation processes, and then weighed in the which is a question of trade-off. Then it happens that what is the trade-off and whether it has to be done in X manner or Y manner, and what kind of a realignment needs to be done in that project so that it can minimize the damage to the nature and then maximize the benefits to the community or in terms of employment, etc. So it's not an easy thing that, or not it's a open-ended thing that you give permissions for destruction, which is a very wrong way of presuming things, which is never done in the formal policy making or decision making process in the governments. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashok. I didn't mean to put you in a spot, but when we say we can convert forests of Great Nicobar for development and do compensatory afforestation in Haryana, it does raise a question, but I won't belabor the point. Do any of the other panelists want to quickly answer, because we are more or less out of time? Anita, Tash, Samir, to that question about development models?
I would just like to add that I think our understanding of trade-offs is very, very poor at this point of time. We need to dramatically increase that. And it's also where science and better measurement can help.
Okay, thanks, Samir. I think unless Anita has something to say, I'm going to wrap things up.
Yeah, I think it's also very important to listen to that area. I think how many people's voices are voiced in this need for development. I think capturing all of those voices, because I know that several times one resolution made by a Gram Sabha has sometimes helped stop something more destructive. So I think the need for more such consensus building, more such ideas and discussions is what I would say is important. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the law actually demands that. We just need to be more open and inclusive and participate. Okay, on that note, I'm going to formally propose a vote of thanks first to our 5 wonderful panelists, Sahana and Tash, who've left because they have other commitments to meet, Ashok, Anita and Samir were still with us, and Kamal, who joined very, very early in the morning to be with us. Our great supporter and donor, Rohini Niratini Philanthropies, who's making biodiversity alive and kicking as the Biodiversity Collaborative for now, and hopefully others will join in this endeavor and provide us the support. Our 2 social media interns, Lisa and Dhruv, who worked quietly but diligently in the back rooms to make a lot of things happen. And the audience, I mean, at one point of time, we had more than 100 people joining us, and 80 of them have continued to be with us right till the end. So thank you very much. And not last but not the least, Nimisha Agarwal and Aditi Sajwan, who put the whole event together. Thank you, everyone. Happy International Biodiversity Day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. And we are going to take the panelist question and send them the panelist way. And for others, I could see a couple of hands. If there are any questions, just send it to contact@biodiversitycollaborative.org. We will take them in. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ravi.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.